Okay, so we are on to book five. We don't really need to say much by way of introduction. We recall that by the end of book four, we had finished the second iteration of the city. And in so doing, we had split the first iteration of the city into a more developed place. We had split it into three classes: the Guardian class on top, the auxiliary class enforcing or preserving the will of the Guardians, and the common or economic class on bottom. And we saw that this second iteration of the city, once it was completed, we saw that it was good. And we knew that it was good because we found in it these four chief virtues. So, in other words, Plato says, well, we know that the city is perfectly good. We can all agree that the city is perfectly good. And because it's perfectly good, we can reason down from that to say that anything which is perfectly good must have these four virtues: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. We saw that what made the city wise, that it was ruled by or it was counseled by that element which had knowledge of the whole. So, in other words, we have this guardian class who was utterly dedicated to the health of the city, and they are in the position to rule it, to give counsel. We saw that it was courageous because it had the second class, the auxiliaries, who were charged with and had the correct nature for the preserving of what the wise counseled. We saw that the city was moderate in that the appetitive classes knew their place. Right? All of the three classes sort of got along with each other and recognized the unique contribution made by each. Most importantly, of course, though, to be moderate means that the appetites are restrained by their superiors, or the appetitive classes, I should say. And then finally, we saw that the city was just. We saw that justice in the city was its adherence to this principle of one man, one job. Right? The correct nature has been assigned to each job, and the various natures do not interfere. They don't make themselves busybodies. The members of the economic classes don't attempt to rule. The members of the auxiliary classes don't attempt to do economic activity, et cetera, et cetera. Each class did what was assigned to it and only that, and that's what made the city just. We saw that these ideas about wisdom, courage, um, moderation, and justice carried over to the level of the individual, right? The individual soul. So an individual is wise to the extent that they are led by their highest faculty, their reason, their logos. We saw that an individual has courage to the extent that they preserve what was meant to be preserved, i.e., they preserve and maintain and fight on behalf of, enforce what the logos deems necessary. We say that an individual is moderate to the extent that their appetites, their alogistikon, this alogistikon element of their soul, is constrained and hemmed in by these better parts. And we saw that the individual is just. Just is a state of almost a kind of spiritual health. It's a state of well orderedness within. And we are just if we are led by our reason, if our reason's dictates are enforced or maintained by our spirit, by our thumos, and if our appetites are duly constrained in this moderate fashion. Right. So, in other words, this principle of specialization or well orderedness applied to the soul. So, moving into book five, what we see is the third iteration of the city. Now, the third iteration of the city does not come about by introducing new classes in the way that we did when we moved from the first to the second iteration of the city. Rather, the third iteration of the city comes into being through three changes to the guardian class, three important changes. Socrates calls these changes waves. Three important waves take place that affect the guardian class in important ways, and we'll talk about each one. Okay, so um, on to these waves. At the beginning of book five, we get a kind of dramatic interruption. So we've had two or three straight books that are pretty much just straightforward dialogue, but then all of a sudden we're reminded in book five that this dialogue is itself part of a kind of fictional narrative. Um, and as we recall, this fictional narrative is kicked off from the very opening lines with Socrates being somewhat forcibly and even maybe upon a kind of threat, being detained by Polemarchus. So Socrates was down at the Piraeus, hanging out with Glaucon, and Polemarchus comes up and says, "Look how many of us there are. You need to come talk to us about justice." And it's pretty clear that Socrates isn't going to get away in this case. And we remember that this kind of dramatic turn reminds us, or is supposed to remind us, of the fact that Socrates was called upon in the Apology and in real life to defend his way of life, to defend philosophy in front of the public, that he lost that trial, and that he was in fact condemned to death. So the threat of violence presented by the people, presented by the masses, presented by the city, the threat of violence against philosophy as a way of life is something that's been sort of lingering in the background, and it comes right back to us here in Book 5. In fact, it comes back far more pronounced, sharpened than it was previously. And so we see at the very beginning of Book 5, this kind of odd thing happens. Socrates sort of continuing on with the discussion that leads off in Book 4. Good then and right is what I call a city, such a city and regime and such a man, while the rest I call bad and mistaken. If this one is really right, and this applies to both governments of cities and the organization of soul and private men, there are four forms of badness. What are they? He said. So we're going to undertake this discussion of the forms of badness, which I think it's in Book 8 or 9 that he resumes this discussion. But all of a sudden, they don't want to hear about this. I was going to speak of them in the order that each appeared to me to pass from one to the other. But Polemarchus, he was sitting at a little distance from Adeimantus, stretched out his hand and took hold of his cloak from above by the shoulder, began to draw him toward himself, and as he stooped over, said some things in his ear, of which we overheard nothing other than his saying, "Shall we let it go, or what shall we do?" One thing to remember here, Polemarchus, remember who he is. His name means chief combatant, chief warrior. He's the son of Cephalus. This is an important man in Athens. Remember, too, who Glaucon and Adeimantus are. These are young men. They're ambitious, but they want to be told reasons to be just. So there's a sense in which, like, part of what's happening in the Republic is you have Socrates on the one hand and Polemarchus on the other hand, representing kind of opposite poles of something. So Socrates represents the philosophical way of life, right? A certain way of thinking about politics, a certain way of thinking about justice and ethics and tradition and everything. And then you have Polemarchus, the city. So Polemarchus represents the way that Athens has always been run and the way that Greek culture has always taken place. Polemarchus is steeped in, Homer and the poets. He's constantly citing the poets. So this is an Athenian, sort of dyed-in-the-wool Athenian. And there's a sense in which they're kind of fighting over these two young men, fighting over Adeimantus and Glaucon, trying to win them over to their way of seeing things. And here we have Polemarchus literally, physically reaching out, grabbing Adeimantus, and kind of pulling him back towards him. So what is the basis of this interruption? Not in the least, said Adeimantus aloud. And I said, what in particular aren't you letting go? You. Because of what in particular, I said. So all of a sudden, we're reminded that Socrates is here sort of against his will. He's here under a kind of threat from Polemarchus. In our opinion, you're taking it easy, he said, and robbing us of a whole section of the argument, and that not the least, so you won't have to go through it. And you supposed you'd get away with it by saying, as though it were something quite ordinary, that after all, it's plain to everyone that as for women and children, the things of friends will be in common. So this is true, actually. If you go back and look, it's maybe a third of the way through Book 4, 424a, I think. Actually, I can't remember the exact pagination, but it's somewhere in that area. What we see is that Socrates drops very, very briefly. He drops this notion that the guardians, who, as we discussed last time, are going to have to live this extremely public life, right? They're not going to have private homes. They're not going to have private occupations. They're not going to have any money or any land. They're not going to have anything that's going to pull them away from their commitment to the city. He drops very, very briefly that they might also not have families, by which he means they might live in sort of like perfect community, which, as he puts it here, means the holding of women and children in common. So holding women and children in common may not strike your ear immediately as like a meaningful phrase. What they mean is this is going to be a community of people who sort of have very free sexual relations with one another. That's one way of putting it. And actually, Socrates goes on and on in this book, Book 5, about the weird sort of public festivals and orgies that they're going to carry on in order to get these people like going. But the basic idea here is there will be no institution of marriage, but there will still be procreation. We'll still need the guardians to reproduce. And so essentially what we'll have is an institution of family that's completely common. So everyone will be husband to every wife, and every wife will be wife to every husband, and all children, because we don't know who's the father, all children will be cared for by the community. So that's pretty wild. Now that's pretty wild now, even in 2026, right? So there have been like some religious communities over the last, since this was written 2,500 years ago, who practiced something like this. But it's pretty rare. I guess if you read the New York Times, there's a lot of talk these days about like polyamory or polycules or whatever. But in those situations, very rarely is anyone actually proposing that this be scaled up, that it be a large number of people, and that they actually raise their children in common, not to know who their parents are. So this is a like legitimately radical proposal. And to be perfectly honest, reading this, you're like, well, okay, Polemarchus and Adeimantus, they really do have a perfectly good reason to object to this. Who would agree to live in such a way? So Socrates is like, oh yeah, I did say that. And you know what? I said some other things. And you know what? I'm going to say a couple more things, and you're not going to like a lot of what I have to say. And so he says there are he compares them. Um, let's see, where does he call them? Waves. Okay, so we're actually jumping. This is probably the only time I'm going to do this. But if we jump up to page 136, 457C, we see that he calls these things waves. He says, may we then assert that we are escaping one way, as it were, in telling about the woman's laws, so that we aren't entirely swept away when we lay it down that our guardians, men and women, must share all pursuits in common. Rather, in a way, the argument is in agreement with itself, that it says what is both possible and beneficial. And indeed, he said, it's not a little wave you're escaping. So there are again, he compares these to waves, and what he means by waves is like these are potentially quite dangerous things that he's proposing. So here comes a big wave. He's got to get over this big wave. He's got to propose this kind of ridiculous thing, and he's got to get it past men like Polemarchus, right? These are soldiers, these are generals, these aren't people who like to entertain ideas like, oh yeah, sure, we'll have men and women in common and we'll raise our children together. I mean, think about the people you know in your life who are military oriented, right? Who maybe spent their life in the military, typically not the most radical people in their private lives. So he's got to get these kind of crazy ideas. He's going to get three of them, and he's got to get it past men like Polemarchus. And there's a real danger here, right? These are waves that could crash over and drown because they're so radical. Okay, so what is the first wave? So the first wave isn't actually men and women in common, but it does have to do with women. So here's what he says on page 129. This is at 451C. Then I said, I must now go back again and say what perhaps should have been said then in its turn. However, maybe it would be right this way after having completely finished the male drama to complete the female, especially since you are so insistent about issuing this summons. For human beings born and educated as we described, there is, in my opinion, no right acquisition and use of children and women other than in their following that path along which we first directed them. Presumably, we attempted in the argument to establish the men as guardians of a herd. Yes, so let's follow this up by prescribing the birth and rearing that go along with it. Consider whether they suit us or not. How? He said, like this. Do we believe the females of the guardian dogs must guard the things the males guard along with them and hunt with them and do the rest in common? Or must they stay indoors as though they were incapacitated as a result of bearing and rearing the puppies while the males work and have all the care of the flock? Everything in common, he said, except that we use the females as weaker and the males as stronger. Is it possible, I said, to use any animal for the same things if you don't assign it the same rearing and education? No, it's not possible. If then we use the women for the same things as the men, they must also be taught the same things. Yes, et cetera, et cetera. Skip down to 452B. What's the most ridiculous thing you see among them? I said. Or is it plain that it's the women exercising naked with the men in the palestras? Not only the young ones, but even the older ones too, like the old men in the gymnasiums who, when they are wrinkled and not pleasant to the eye, all the same love gymnastic. By Zeus, he said they would look ridiculous in the present state of saying, well, I said, since we started to speak, we mustn't be afraid of all the jokes of whatever kind the wits might make if such a change took place in gymnastics, in music, and not the least in the bearing of arms, riding horses, which you say is right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so there's a couple things going on here, and we can kind of skip over the rest of this discussion for now and just sort of summarize it. What he's suggesting here is that if we think back to the education of the guardians, right, we were always thinking, particularly when we were thinking about their education in gymnastics, which is to say their physical education, that we're talking about men. But what about women? So, in the case of philosopher dogs, in the case of dogs in general, if you have a male and female dog, you don't keep the male dog outside to do the guarding and the shepherding and keep the female dogs inside, right? Just because they have puppies, i.e., just because they undertake the physical burdens of childbirth, doesn't mean that they're somehow unsuited for the rest of the business of being a dog. Well, what about guardians? Um, is there any reason to separate the men and women with respect to guardianship? So, what Plato does here is very interesting. He does not deny that men and women might have different natures. And in fact, he goes on at some length about their different natures. And he does say that these natures have at least something to do with certain biological facts, and especially the biological facts surrounding the question of childbirth. But he says, are these differing natures, are they different with respect to those activities we expect the guardians to undertake? Right. So, does childbirth and does the time and effort and the physical changes associated with childbirth, does it imply that whatever it is that guardianship is about, whatever it is that guardianship is the activity of doing, whatever that is, does it mean you can't do that? And he suggests that, in fact, there is no reason to suspect that just because a woman has this different nature, different with respect to these things, that they can't do the business of guardianship. And if they can do the business of guardianship, if we have no reason to suspect that they can't love and evaluate and judge the city as well as their male counterparts, then they must also receive the exact same education that the males receive. We said that it's so important that these male guardians behave in a certain way, that they're formed in a certain way, and we're going to attend to their education over the course of two entire books of this dialogue. We thought the education was so important to the males. Well, if the females are going to be doing the same thing, then they must receive the same education. They're all going to go to the same schooling. They're all going to be taught the same thing. They're all going to be given the same physical and musical and spiritual education. And note too, part of the reason that I read these passages in the middle of this page, he's trying to sort of pepper this conversation with like jokes, right? So he's saying, they're going to get the same education, and that means that the women are going to be exercising naked in the palaestra, right? It means that these old women, can you even imagine these old wrinkly women who are old and flabby and gross and whatever? They're going to be in the gymnasium wrestling around, and they're going to be naked. And isn't that going to be really funny? So again, he's introducing something radical. He's introducing the idea that with respect to ruling, there is no distinction between male and female, and that therefore, with respect to the education due to these rulers, there is no difference with respect to male and female. I mean, that's also kind of a radical idea today. So we don't have laws barring women from public office, but if you look around and see how many women we have in public office, clearly we have difficulty imagining, put it that way, we have difficulty imagining men and women ruling on equal footing. Right? We've never had a woman president. We've never had, we've had one woman vice president. If you look at women representatives in Congress and elsewhere, they're still very clearly, very distinctly a minority. So what Plato's suggesting here is actually pretty radical. And it's going to be especially radical in Greece 2,500 years ago in an audience of exclusively men and exclusively men bound to the traditions of Athens. And so he's like, oh, this is pretty crazy. This is pretty wild. I'm going to make some jokes and try to make this go down a little bit. Okay, so the first wave, the first radical reform that he undertakes with the guardian class is that there will be women guardians and that they'll receive the same education as the men receive. And by the way, so undergrads often kind of confuse this a little bit. The three reforms we're going to introduce only apply to the guardian class. So when we talk about men and women or families in common, it does not apply to the economic class. Arguably, it doesn't really apply to the soldiers either, but there's some interpretive differences about that. Okay, so what's the second? We see on page 136, middle of the page, um, we've escaped the first wave, and here we have a second wave. So right here in the middle of the page, the law that follows this one, i.e. the introduction of women into the guardian class, the law that follows this one, I said, and the others that went before is, as I suppose, this. What? All these women are to belong to all these men in common, and no woman is to live privately with any man. And the children, in their turn, will be in common, and neither will a parent know his own offspring or child, his parent. This one is far bigger than the other, right? So this is a pretty big thing. So not only are we going to have women guardians, and not only are they going to receive the same education as the men receive, but we're abolishing the family. Right? There will be no marriage. There will be no private domiciles. Now, this is pretty radical, but if we think about it for more than a moment, we see that this really is just a continuation, a kind of natural conceptual continuation of what he establishes earlier. The guardians, for them to be perfect, for them to be the best that they can be, they must love one thing and one thing only, and that is the city. Don't forget their claim to rule. The reason why they should rule is because, unlike everyone else, they know they have a particular kind of knowledge. They can see the city as a whole, and they can see the city as a whole, and they're willing to study the city as a whole. They're willing to dedicate their life to the investigation of and the observation of the city because they love it, and they love it more than anyone else. And so for Socrates, this love of the city, this public orientedness, there's a kind of constant threat to this, and that threat is private life, right? So if you have a private occupation, if you have a lot of money, or if you have a lot of land, or any kind of big private interests, and of course, if you have a family, these are things that can distract you from your love of country. These are things that can lead you astray. These are things that can conflict with your love of country. If you're considering, for example, a law regarding taxes, taxation, if you're considering a law regarding land use, it's going to weigh on your mind if you yourself own a lot of land, or if one of your kids owns a lot of land, or if you're thinking about whether or not to go to war with a neighboring city and you know that your kids are in the military and they're likely to die, right? That's going to affect your decision making. And so he says, in order to bring them as close to a perfect unity, this class, with one another, we are going to have to get rid of the family, which means no wives, and it means no one knows who their children are. Now, he goes on about this forever, and he introduces sort of reform after reform after reform of how they're going to kind of preserve this unity. And so there's going to be these public festivals, but people are going to be wearing masks, and that's when they're all going to have sex with one another, as like in order to have children all at the same time. At the same time, there's going to be some among the guardians who are going to be tasked with making sure that the very best guardians end up sleeping with each other just to increase the odds of having the best possible offspring. It goes on like this forever. Um, and actually, a very, and by the way, before we skip over this, a very good statement of the reason for this comes here on 141, very middle of the page. Have we any greater evil for a city than what splits it and makes it many instead of one, or a greater good than what binds it together and makes it one? No, we don't. Doesn't the community of pleasure and pain bind it together when, to the greatest extent possible, all the citizens alike rejoice and are pained at the same comings into being and perishings? Right. What he's kind of declaring war on here, what he's trying to abolish, is privacy, private life in general. He wants them to associate so strongly with one another that they always put the interests of the city ahead of their own. So he goes on and on and on like this. It really is like most of the chapter for all these reforms to do with the abolition of the family. But finally, these guys kind of get tired of this, and they get the sense that Socrates is like slow walking this discussion, that he is avoiding pushing beyond this, that he's kind of introducing rules upon rules and making jokes to kind of distract them from what he's ultimately doing. So here on 151 at 471c, let it be given, he said, and this and what went before are fine. But Socrates, I think that if one were to allow you to speak about this sort of thing, you would never remember what you previously set aside in order to say all this. Is it possible for this regime to come into being, and how is it ever possible? I see that if it should come into being, everything would be good for the city in which it came into being. And I can tell things that you leave out, namely that they would be the best at fighting their enemies, et cetera. So he's like, listen, this sounds fine. All these reforms sound fine, but is this kind of thing even Is this even possible? And Socrates is like, well, it might not be possible. It might not be strictly speaking possible. And it might not be strictly speaking possible, especially if we're trying to introduce every little reform ahead of time now. If we're trying to come up with every rule that such a regime might need. There's really only one rule that we would need to introduce. And this rule he considers to be by far the most radical. So we finally get this third wave, the final rule, the most important, and the one that most fundamentally affects this third iteration of the city. We get it on page 153, middle of the page. So next, this is Socrates speaking. So next, as it seems, we must try to seek out and demonstrate what is badly done in cities today, and thereby keeps them from being governed in this way, and with what smallest change, preferably one, if not two, and if not the fewest in number and the smallest in power, a city would come to this manner of regime. That's entirely certain, he said. Well, then I said, with one change, not however a small or an easy one, but possible, we can, in my opinion, show that it would be transformed. What change, he said. Well, here I am, so coming to what we likened to the biggest wave, but it shall be said regardless, even if exactly like an uproarious wave is going to drown me in laughter and ill repute. Consider what I'm going to say. Speak, he said. They're getting so tired of him just delaying and delaying. And here it is. Unless the philosophers rule as kings, or those now called kings and chiefs genuinely and adequately philosophize, and political power and philosophy coincide in the same place, while the many natures now making their way to either apart from the other are by necessity excluded, there is no rest from ills for the cities, my dear Glaucon, nor I think for humankind, nor will the regime we have now described in speech ever come forth from nature so far as possible and see the light of the sun. So here's the third wave. The third wave is that philosophers ought to rule, or, and he does mention this, that rulers ought to philosophize. So they need to be the same. So this is kind of interesting. And so we can start off by kind of pointing out a couple of things. So one, this may not seem that radical, but again, this is truly radical. And this is as radical today as it was then. We have had some philosopher kings in this country. Of course, we don't have kings, we have presidents. We have had some. Figures like Jefferson and Madison, I would say, border on philosophy. A guy like Abraham Lincoln borders on philosophy. We've also had some sort of academic presidents in the past. Barack Obama most recently was an academic. So we've had some, but typically when it comes time to elect people, when it comes time to elect our representatives in Congress and in the executive branch, we tend to like lawyers. We tend to like businessmen. We tend not to like egghead philosophers. Now, this is radical today. This was probably a lot more radical in Greece, and I want you to think about it in these terms. There had been exactly one philosopher. The word philosophy, the name philosopher, was associated in the 4th century BCE in Athens with exactly one person, and that was Socrates. And as we've recalled several times, you know exactly what they did to Socrates. They went out of their way to kill this guy. They hated him so much that they forced him to drink hemlock just to get rid of him. So philosophy at this time was not something you could major in college. It wasn't something that like people thought was kind of cool or whatever, even if they didn't do it themselves. It was something they hated. And here's Plato suggesting that we will only have just a just regime. We will only achieve a good regime if this man that you totally hated, this thing that he did that you totally hated, we'll only have a just regime if this man or those like him rule over you and tell you what to do. So that's pretty radical. We would say that this completes the city. So this is the final change. This is the third wave that establishes and finishes the third iteration of the city. And so really what he's done here is he's made the following change to the second iteration of the city. So we saw in the second iteration of the city that we were going to have three classes, right? We remember the three classes: the guardians, the auxiliaries, and the commoners, right? We recall that the auxiliaries were those who had thumos, those who had a spirited nature. And we recall that the guardians were selected from among the auxiliaries, those auxiliaries who most loved the city, who best loved the city. they would be observed and selected from a young age, and they would be pulled into this guardian class, kind of in the same way that we promote people in the army to lead it, right? So the best of the auxiliaries would become the guardians. Well, now this isn't true. Now, those with spirited souls, they're going to stay in the auxiliary class. Men like Polemarchus, with a spirited soul, who think that justice is doing good to friends and harm to enemies, they're going to be auxiliaries, and they're not really going to be guardians. Why? Because only a certain kind of person is going to be a guardian, and that person is a philosopher. Only the philosophers, and they are not spirited. They're a different kind of thing. Um, so a couple things to note. I mean, really, the last thing we need to discuss is what philosophy is and what a philosopher is. We note in the rest of this paragraph, we note that Polemarchus says, and he said, so Polemarchus and Glaucon are saying, Socrates, what a phrase and argument you have let burst out. Now that it's said, you can believe that very many men, and not ordinary ones, will on the spot throw off their clothes and strip for action, taking hold of whatever weapon falls under the hand of each, run full speed at you to do wonderful deeds. If you don't defend yourself with speech and get away, you'll really pay the penalty in scorn. So they're saying, listen, Socrates, this is your craziest idea. Yet they killed Socrates, the original Socrates. They're going to kill you too. People are not going to like this. To which Socrates replies, isn't it you, I said, that's responsible for this happening to me? And it's a fine thing I'm doing, he said. But no, I won't betray you, and I'll defend you with what I can. I can provide goodwill and encouragement, and perhaps I would answer you more suitably than another. And so, with the assurance of such support, try to show the disbelievers that it is as you say. So this is Polemarchus saying, you know what, Socrates, I will be your help. I will assist you in your business. So Polemarchus has kind of been won over, the kind of dramatic action of the dialogue. He's saying, you know what, Socrates, you've explained yourself. I can see that you're a good guy and that you have good ideas, and I will assist you going forward. When the others come to kill you, I will protect you. So he's kind of finished the discussion with Polemarchus here. He's kind of won him over. Okay. So one last thing is, what is a philosopher? So we talked about this a little bit before. The Greek philosopher is derived from, I think we've actually literally done this on this sheet, philo plus sophia, a lover of knowledge, a lover of wisdom. So how will we know a philosopher? If what we need to rule over us is philosophy, how will we know it when we found it? So almost immediately, Glaucon and Adeimantus are like, oh, I know what philosophers are like. These are lovers of knowledge. These are people who, in the way he puts it on 155, this is at 475b, the one who's willing to taste every kind of learning with gusto and who approaches learning with delight and is insatiable. We shall justly assert to be a philosopher, won't we? So we can kind of picture this in our heads. If philosophy is a love of knowledge, then you could say that like somebody who's really good at Jeopardy, like Ken Jennings, that's got to be a philosopher, right? Someone who knows a ton of things. Scientists know a ton of things. Surely that's what we mean by a philosopher. Um, those who are worldly, those who have had many, many different experiences are what we mean by philosophy. And Socrates wants to disabuse us specifically of this idea. He calls these people lovers of sights and sounds. And the way this comes out in the Greek is philodoxa, a philodoxer, so a philosopher versus a philodoxer. Doxa is the root of our word dog. It just means opinion. So there are people, he thinks, who love opinions. And what he means by love opinions is maybe they read a ton of books. Maybe they read a ton of different kinds of food, eat a ton of different kinds of food. Maybe they are well traveled. Maybe they've seen customs that exist in crazy places. Maybe they've been to see, you know, Aboriginal tribes in the Amazon, and they're familiar with radically different ways of life, and they've sampled all of these different things, and they've collected all of these different observations about the world and what's in it. Is that what we mean by a philosopher, someone who loves knowledge? And Socrates says that it is not. What these people love is ultimately appearances. What they love ultimately is opinions. What they are in love with are what he calls instances of being, which is to say things that come into but eventually go out of existence. Right? Those who simply collect observations, who simply collect data, who simply collect information. Those people collect opinions. They are not philosophers. So if we think about Socrates like biographically, what we know about him, Socrates was not well traveled. In fact, he brags in the Crito that he only left the city of Athens twice, and it was to fight in war on behalf of Athens. When he's given the opportunity to survive his trial and to go live in Thebes, he says he won't leave. He won't leave Athens. So he was not a worldly guy. He was not well traveled. We have no evidence to suggest that he was ever like well informed. Like, he didn't clearly he didn't care for poetry. There wasn't a ton of literature to read at the time, but there's no reason to suspect that Socrates was like up to date on Greek science or Greek medicine or anything like that. So he didn't really know that much. He was a stonemason by trade, but apparently he wasn't very good, so he didn't have a lot of practical knowledge. But what made Socrates a philosopher is that he wasn't really interested in how they live elsewhere or different cultures or how they do things around the world. What he was interested in is something different. He was interested in ideas. And what I mean by ideas here is he was interested in the way that he puts it elsewhere in the Republic is being, not beings, not appearances, but capital B being, the way things really are. He wasn't interested in appearances. He was interested in realities, eternal, universal realities, right? That's what he was attuned to. He was attuned to what you may have heard in just discussions about Plato or philosophy more generally. He was attuned to the forms of things. Now, the best place to illustrate this idea of the forms, the best place to see a kind of shorthand for the difference between philosophy and philodoxy, between philosophers and philodoxers, is at the beginning of Book 7. The beginning of Book 7, we get Plato's allegory of cave. And so what I want you to do, we're going to skip Book 6. It's not particularly relevant for us. I want you to go to Book 7, read the first 5 or 6 pages, which include the allegory of cave. And then we'll come back and in one last video, we will discuss the allegory of cave, and specifically we'll discuss what it says about philosophy and why it is that philosophy is thereby entitled to rule in the way that Socrates describes it. All right, guys, that's it for now. Talk soon.